Hello everyone, this is Ann Ledgerwood, a pediatric physical therapist, musician, and also self-published author of some children's books that are available on Amazon. I just want to read this to you today. This is the second book. I wrote these books, this book in particular in 2017, so it's been around for a while. Started off because I like to tell stories with my granddaughter Riley in them. So this is the book Choral Music. Beautiful illustration by local artist Jonathan Davis. Beautiful, beautiful. And I'm going to be picking up with chapter 3. In about 15 minutes, we arrived at the hospital in Tazewell. Mrs. Harmon and Ben helped Rory through the emergency room door. Rory was humming a bit, but was remarkably calm considering what had just happened. If his arm hurt, he didn't show it. I overheard Mrs. Harmon talking to the nurse about Rory. A bookshelf fell on him, and I think his arm is broken. Please be very gentle. Rory doesn't like to be touched. Be easy with him when you examine him, and he talks very little, maybe just 1 or 2 words. Thank you, ma'am. Bring him back this way, said the nurse as she motioned for them to step through the swinging doors into the back. Mrs. Harmon walked with her arm around Rory while Ben held his right arm wrapped in the magazines. The door closed behind them, and we were left to find a seat and wait. The waiting room was not very crowded. Mrs. Musick, would it be okay if we wait outside with Patch and Choral Music? I asked. This might take a while. Of course, Mrs. Musick said. I will wait in here. You girls stay outside with them. It's not good for them to be in the car very long, even with the windows cracked. Mrs. Musick was always thinking about the animals. As we were walking toward the car, Riley said, Poor Rory. I wonder how in the world that bookshelf fell on him. It is huge. I thought the same thing, I said. Maybe he was trying to reach a book or climb up on it for some reason. He doesn't talk enough to tell us. Maybe he'll tell us one day, Riley said. I sure hope so. We opened the rear door of the station wagon. Out jumped Patch and Choral Music. Patch licked my hand and Choral Music scampered down the sidewalk, kicking up her heels. That was something she always liked to do. Today was no different. Mrs. Musick called it frolicking. I like that word. Riley and I would sometimes sing, Choral Music, likes to play and likes to frolic. We like to make up songs. Come here, Choral Music, stop, come back here, I yelled. But of course, Choral Music did not stop. She was not a good listener at all that day or any day. When she was not on the leash, she was a bit wild. But as soon as the leash went on, she would act as if she had been to obedience school. Unfortunately, she did not have on her leash. There was no obedience at that moment. She pranced down the sidewalk and behind a bush, and then out again, then behind another bush next to the hospital building. You go that way, and I'll go this way, Riley yelled as she ran after our wayward goat. We'll trap her behind that bush. We reached the bush and were ready to grab her when the most amazing thing happened. Choral Music jumped straight up and over the bush and then jumped on the hood of our car. All of her legs moved at the same time like she was on a double pogo stick, if there is such a thing. She didn't stay there very long. Then she jumped onto the roof of the car and off onto the ground. She bounded and bounded across the parking lot, jumping way up high, at least 8 or 10 feet off the ground. Each time she jumped, it was with all 4 feet at the same time. I could almost hear boing, boing, boing every time she jumped. I had never heard anything like it, and I had never seen anything like it. Choral Music was tiny, but she was jumping as tall as some of the trees. This is plumb crazy. I think she has springs in her legs, yelled Riley. We'll never catch her. As we chased Choral Music, I saw Mrs. Musick looking out of the window from the waiting room. She rushed to the door and I yelled, We have to catch Choral Music. Don't worry, we'll be right back. Mrs. Musick waved and went back inside. Okay, little girl, come back here right now. I could hear Riley as she chased the goat. Choral Music kept hopping and springing along so far and fast that it made me think of Tigger out of the book The House at Pooh Corner. As Tigger said, bouncing is what Tiggers do best. At that moment, bouncing was what Choral Music did best. Tigger would have been proud. Patch was right there beside me as we chased our silly goat. Patch, see if you can keep up with her. We can't let her get away. Patch seemed to understand me and ran ahead as Choral Music bounced along. Choral Music was having a wonderful time jumping and prancing past house after house as we tried to catch her. My legs were getting tired. I was thankful that Patch had 4 legs and was able to keep up with her. Annie Beth, I have to rest a minute, Riley yelled as she stopped and leaned over to catch her breath. We had chased Choral Music a long way, past 5 or 6 houses. We were now beside a big pasture with a few cows in the distance. As Riley stopped and sat down for a moment, Choral Music suddenly stopped too. We could not have kept up with her much longer. Choral Music looked back at us with a twinkle in her eyes as if to say, "Come on, friends, don't stop now. Lots more fun to be had. Let's jump, let's bounce." "If this is what frolicking is, then I won't be singing that song anymore," said Riley. "I am worn out. If I had known she would stop, I would have sat down way back there." I was remembering our little jingle. Choral music likes to play and likes to frolic. Maybe we should change the words. Choral music runs away and likes to frolic. We looked at Choral Music, and thankfully, for some unknown reason, she seemed to have a change of heart. Just as quickly as her strange bouncing had started, it had stopped. She turned and walked back toward us. "Hallelujah," Riley said. My heart was about to give out. In the frenzy of getting out of the car and Choral Music's escape from us and her bouncing spree, I had forgotten to get her leash. "Oh no," I said. "I don't want to carry her all the way back. I can't believe I forgot her leash. I'm afraid she will run away again." Choral Music was not so easy to carry anymore. "Let's see what happens," said Riley, and she began to slowly walk back in the direction of the car. I started to walk back too, and Patch walked right up beside me as always. I was afraid to look back, so I just walked, looking ahead, and Riley slowly turned her face to the left to look behind her as best she could without moving too quickly. "She's starting to follow us. She's just walking," Riley slowly and quietly said. "No frolicking or bouncing, thank goodness. Let's keep moving until we get close enough to carry her back and get the leash." As Choral Music started walking back with us, a chickadee landed on her back. After another few steps, 2 others landed there as well. We didn't notice at first because we were trying to make Choral Music think that we weren't watching her. It seemed that the less we paid attention to her, the better she acted. She continued to follow us toward the car. "I'll bet your mom will be worried about us," Riley said to me. That was the second time today that someone had referred to Mrs. Musick as my mother. I looked over at Riley. "Oh, I'm so sorry, Annie Beth. I didn't mean anything by that." "It's okay, Riley. I think Mrs. Musick would make a very nice mother," I said quietly. "I kind of like the idea, I guess." At that moment, we heard lots of chirping. We looked back and saw the 3 little chickadees all in a row riding on the back of a baby goat with a coral collar. Who would ever believe such a thing? And the birds were singing at the top of their lungs. It was a lovely, happy song. "I wish I knew what they were saying with their singing," I said. "I know," said Riley, "just like the one singing to Rory at his house." Choral Music was obediently following along behind us on our slow and careful walk back. She seemed to be pretty proud that she was giving the birds a little ride. When we were fairly close to the car, Riley said, "Annie Beth, I'll slowly turn around and hold her until you get the leash." Riley turned around and sweet-talked Choral Music, saying, "Here you go, little girl. Come to me. Come to Riley." I walked quietly and quickly to the car and brought the leash back to Choral Music. After it was hooked on her collar, she was back to her normal self, and the birds flew up into a tree. We walked a short distance back to the hospital and sat down on the sidewalk with Patch and Choral Music. "What in the world just happened?" I asked. "I can't believe how high she jumped and bounced. She was just like Tigger." "I know," said Riley. "And then she gave those little birds a ride while they sang to her. Craziest thing I've ever seen. Seems like we see lots of unbelievable things together. Last summer we saw that lavender bird that knew your name and talked to you. Now a baby goat with super jumping powers. It's crazy." We looked up and saw Mrs. Musick coming out of the hospital with Rory, Ben, and Mrs. Harmon. Rory was wearing a new white cast on his right arm. There didn't seem to be any other injuries. "How are you, Rory?" Riley and I asked at the same time. Rory looked at us and smiled. I thought how I liked that he had smiled at me. A smile is such a wonderful thing to receive, and a nice thing to give away, too. "Broken wrist," Mrs. Harmon said. "Should heal up fine in 6 weeks. So very thankful he didn't need surgery," she paused. "Now back to the house to begin to clean up the books. Ruth, I am so glad you came by today, and just at the right time. It would have been so much worse if we had to wait on a ride or call the rescue squad. Rory would have been scared to death of the sound of the siren and all the new sights and smells." Rory looked up in the tree and saw the 3 birds. "Birds," he said. Riley and I looked at each other. The 3 chickadees flew down from the tree and landed on Rory's cast. They looked at him and cocked their heads to the side. Then they started to chirp, "It's okay, it's okay, it's okay." It was just like earlier in the day at Rory's house. Riley leaned over to me and said quietly, "I wonder if one of them could have been at his house this morning. I don't know. Sure would be a long way to fly for such a little bird." Mrs. Musick said, "Let's go. We need to get you home. I imagine that Rory is tired." "But what about the birds?" I asked. "What birds?" Mrs. Harmon said. "Those birds," Riley said and pointed to the chickadee trio. Just then, Rory lifted his cast and the birds were gone. There was a speck of green on the tips of their right wings as they flew away. At first I thought the green was a reflection of green in the trees, but the leaves weren't green now. The tiny spots of green flashed against the yellows, reds, and browns of the leaves. "Didn't you see those birds? They rode all the way here on Choral Musick's back from the pasture," Riley said as she pointed to the pasture. Mrs. Harmon and Mrs. Musick looked puzzled. "I didn't see any birds. Did you, Ruth?" Mrs. Harmon asked Mrs. Musick. "No, Lottie, I didn't see any birds," Mrs. Musick answered. Riley gave me a questioning look. Ben looked at us and winked. He must have seen the birds too. Rory looked up and seemed to be searching for his little friends. We rode back to their house in the back of the station wagon. We didn't say much but held on to Patch and Choral Musick. I really wanted to talk with Ben about the birds. Ruth, thank you so much for taking us," Mrs. Harmon said. "I don't know what we would have done if you hadn't been here." "No need to thank us. I'm glad we were here too," Mrs. Musick responded. When we pulled into the lane at their house, Mrs. Harmon walked with Rory toward the front of the house. She thanked us again. Ben walked to the back of the station wagon and opened the tailgate. Mrs. Musick had walked to the porch with Mrs. Harmon and Rory. "Did you see the birds?" Riley asked Ben. "They had tiny green spots on their wings, almost like a ring if they had fingers." "Yes, I saw them. There were the 3 little chickadees sitting on Rory's cast," answered Ben. "I saw the green, too. Looked like different shades." "Why didn't your mother and Mrs. Musick see them?" I asked. "I think sometimes adults are so busy with being adults that they miss the magic and fun in the little things in life." Ben closed the tailgate as we waited on Mrs. Musick. "If they didn't see the birds, they would never have believed what happened when y'all were in the hospital," Riley said. "Choral Musick started acting wild and crazy and hopped like a giant kangaroo, way up high, higher than a car. There was nothing normal about that at all." "I wish I could have seen that," Ben said. "Maybe Choral Musick will go wild and crazy sometime when I'm around." As Mrs. Musick opened the driver's side door to get in, she hollered back at us, "Girls, let's get home. We'll go look at the leaves another day. Time to get ready for supper. There's school tomorrow." "Thank you again for helping us today, Mrs. Musick," Ben said as he walked away from us. It was nice to meet you and the girls and the pets. I hope to see you again sometime soon." Riley and I got into the back seat with Coral Musick and Patch sitting right beside us. We waved to Ben as Mrs. Musick turned the car around and we headed home. Riley and I were very quiet. I was thinking about the things that had happened today. I was thankful that Rory only had a broken arm and that it would heal quickly. I remembered chasing the springing and bouncing Tigger, who on every day until today was just my normal little pet goat, Coral Musick. I pondered the chickadees that seemed to speak to Rory, and I was puzzled that the grown-ups didn't see the birds. Maybe Ben was right. Maybe grown-ups are too busy being grown up and filling their minds each day with the things that grown-ups do. I liked seeing magical things. I thought that if that is what happens when a person grows up, that I would rather stay a child. Chapter 4. More than a week had passed since the day Rory broke his arm. So many unusual things had happened that day. I couldn't stop thinking about seeing and hearing the chickadees singing that sweet song as they rode along on the back of a baby goat, all in a row. No one would believe it if I told them. And there was the wild, super baby goat Coral Musick hopping and jumping up so high. No one would believe that either. I was so thankful that Riley was there to see it with me. It seemed to me that Riley and I had been able to experience many unusual things since we met last summer. I guess that's how it is with friends. Mrs. Musick had called several times to check on Rory. When Mrs. Musick called on Wednesday afternoon, Mrs. Harmon invited us to come over on Saturday for a picnic and a hayride. Mrs. Musick accepted the invitation and asked what she could bring. "How about a side dish and a dessert? Maybe some ham biscuits?" There was a pause. "Yes, Lottie, that would be nice," Mrs. Musick said. "We'll be there. My husband will be home too." Another pause. "Oh, yes. I know. It's the peak of color now." I was listening from the next room and smiled. It seemed to me that everyone I knew talked a lot about the peak of the fall colors. It also seemed a good thing that so much excitement and pleasure came from the leaves changing color. I was thankful for beauty and simple things. "Annie Beth," Mrs. Musick called, "we've been invited to the Harmon's house for a picnic and hayride on Saturday. I'm taking ham biscuits and maybe broccoli casserole. I need to take a dessert too. What dessert should I take?" "You make the best chocolate chip cookies, soft and chewy. Please take them. I can help you make them," I answered. "Okie dokie, that's what we'll take." Mrs. Musick was smiling and moving quickly in the kitchen. She was a person who always saw the world with her glass not just half full, but overflowing. I really liked spending time with her. "And Riley and her family are going too." Mrs. Musick began to hum a happy song as she started peeling potatoes for supper. "I've never been on a hayride," I said. "Well, goodness mercy, it's high time," she replied with a smile. Suddenly, I thought my heart would burst. I was so happy, yet I was also scared that this wouldn't last for me. What if I had to leave this house and stay somewhere else? I couldn't remember being this happy. I had lived with many families after my mom left and my grandmother died. I wondered if this could end too. Sometimes it was a nice family and I wanted to stay. Sometimes it was a not so nice family and I wanted to leave. I was overwhelmed with wanting to stay here in this safe home with these kind of people. "Mrs. Musick, may I ask you something?" I asked quietly. "Well, of course, my dear. What do you want to know?" Mrs. Musick glanced up from the potatoes. I hesitated. "Do I get to stay here, or will I have to move to stay with another family someday?" My eyes were down and I felt my lip begin to quiver. Mrs. Musick wiped her hands on her apron and walked over to me. She knelt in front of me so that we were eye to eye. "Annie Beth, you can stay here as long as you want. There's no reason for you to leave unless you want to leave. Claude and I love you. You know that, don't you? We want you to stay here permanently, if you would like. A tear slid out of the corner of my eye. My lip quivered a little bit more as I spoke, almost in a whisper. Yes, I would like that. I would like that. Mrs. Musick hugged me. Yes, Annie Beth, yes, yes. Claude and I would like to have you stay here. She leaned back from me with her hands on my shoulders and her safe, loving eyes meeting mine. We want to adopt you. Would that be okay? Yes, I replied, still in a near whisper. I looked up. Then can I call you Mama? Oh, yes, you can call me Mama. You can call me Mama now. You can call me Mommy or Mother or Ma or Mama, whatever you would like. She hugged me so close. I squeezed her neck and didn't want to let go. I want to stay here forever. I paused and took a deep breath. Mama. Tears were streaming down her cheeks. I love you, Annie Beth. I can't wait to tell Claude. He will be so happy. We've always wanted a child. You are the answer to many prayers. Thank you for letting me stay here. Thank you for letting me be in your family, I said. My new mother kept hugging me and stroking my hair. I had never felt so loved. In my mind, I could hear my birth mother's voice spoken through the lavender bird last summer. I'm here, Annie Beth. You don't need to be afraid. You have a friend in Riley. You have the Musicks. They love you, and God loves you too. Please use your beautiful voice. Please know that I love you too. There are many, many things in life that don't seem to make sense at the time. And some things may never make sense in this lifetime. I had never understood why my mother left when I was 4. I had wanted to know why so I could try to understand. But maybe we're not supposed to understand everything in life. There was one thing I knew at this moment. I was thankful. I had another mother who would love me and care for me as much as anyone could. I was very thankful. The phone rang on the wall in the kitchen. It startled both of us. My new mama stood up and picked up the phone. Hello? There was a pause. Claude, oh, I'm so glad you called. I have the most wonderful news. Annie Beth wants to be in our family forever. There was another pause. Yes, I told her that we had prayed and prayed for a child. I told her that we want to adopt her. Another pause. Then Mama said, Annie Beth, Claude wants to talk with you. I had always been shy around Mr. Musick. He was a big man, strong and tall and a little stocky. He laughed a lot when he was home, and he liked to tell funny stories. He and Mrs. Musick had always seemed to be a good fit. He was always kind and respectful to Mrs. Musick, and to me as well. So why was I shy around him? I wasn't really sure, except that I hadn't been around many men at all in my life. I didn't know anything about my father and very little about my mother. I'd lived with my grandma for a couple of years before she died, and her husband had already passed away when I came. So I guess I felt awkward and unsure of myself around him. But then again, I had just started learning how to feel good about myself. I reached out my hand for the phone and put it to my ear. Hello? I said in a quiet voice. Through the phone, I heard the warm, generous voice of Mr. Musick, my new father, my daddy. Annie Beth, I am so happy that you want to be our child forever. You are precious to us, and we love you very much. I could see his big smile through the phone. I couldn't be happier. Ruth and I are thrilled, he continued. I took a deep breath and said, I'm happy too. I want to be in your family forever. I looked at my new mama. Tears were streaming down her face to her chin. My eyes were filled to overflowing too. She handed me a dainty white handkerchief to dry my eyes. It was hand-stitched with tiny pink flowers and lace trim. I'm happy too, I repeated. Thank you, Mr. Musick. I mean, Daddy. I wanted to say Mama and Daddy more than anything, but it was still new and a bit awkward. More than a few times I said Mrs. Musick or Mr. Musick over the next few weeks, but before long, Mama and Daddy came out naturally. I carefully folded that handkerchief and kept it in the drawer of my nightstand with other special treasures of my childhood. Those tender tears that it caught were a special memory for me. I never washed the handkerchief. So that October day, around twilight, I was given the gift that I had wanted for so long. All of my life, since my mom left and my grandma died, I had not allowed myself to think about where I would live more than a day at a time. Now things were different. I had parents who loved me and wanted me. They wanted me to stay. I now had the gifts of safety and stability, gifts that so many people take for granted, and the peace that comes from knowing that I was loved and that I belong. Such are the gifts that matter. So that's the end of chapter 4 from the book Choral Music that I wrote, published through Amazon in 2017. If you want to hear more of the book, I will be reading it in its entirety, starting with chapter 5 in the next one. Thanks for tuning in.